Hi everyone, thanks for coming. All those things that were just said about me are true, but when people ask me what I do these days, I say that it's my job to document, describe and explain non-existent genres of music. Because a couple of years ago I decided to write a book about the influence of romantic poetry and philosophy on rock and roll, which meant that I knew I had to write about David Bowie, I knew I had to write about Robert Smith, I knew I had to write about Billy Corgan and his Smashing Pumpkins, and I knew that I had to write about emo. And I thought, oh, that'll be easy, the world's full of emo bands. And I found very quickly, as Andy Greenwald, who wrote the definitive book on emo, already had, that emo bands vanish as soon as you uncover them. That is, no emo band will admit to being emo. So if you assume, and I think it's sensible, that for a genre to exist, somebody has to claim to represent it, it must follow that there is no such thing as emo. And now I'm working, this thing is happening again, I'm working on a project for the Powerhouse Museum as part of their amazing The 80s Are Back exhibition, which is opening in December of this year. It's all about living in Australia in the 1980s, and the Powerhouse's curator, Peter Cox, has asked me to curate a section of this show about the 80s revival. Now, I'm sure you've noticed the 80s revival. I'm sure you've noticed that synth pop is back, that house music is back, hip house is even back, Madonna is back, giant 80s tape decks are back, shoulder pads, t-shirts with big words on them, they're all back. I'm sure you've heard at some point music by Empire of the Sun, La Rue, Cut Copy, the Midnight Juggernauts, Peaches, The Killers, Infusion, maybe Lady Gaga even. This 80s revival thing has been going on for a while now, actually. It's, in fact, if you take its starting point as the release of Daft Punk's song Digital Love in 1999, then the 80s revival is now officially 10 years old. Happy birthday, 80s revival. So as part of putting this exhibit together to demonstrate this 80s revival thing, I started listening to interviews with all of these bands to find out what this 80s revival business was all about. And I very quickly discovered that in music, at least, there was no such thing as the 80s revival because nobody wanted anything to do with it. Last year, just to give you one example, last year the Australian hip-hop group TZU released a great song called Computer Love. It's a great track. It's packed with video game beeps and boops of the type that I really love. It's got lyrics which contain references to Blade Runner. The chorus is sung through a vocoder. I love vocoders. And the video is, well, it more or less follows the story of Tron, although once MC Joelistics is scanned into the computer, he has a sort of a Donkey Kong adventure and then later meets E.T. It's pretty 80s. So when Triple J's Zan Rowe talked to them on her show, and she asked them if they were big fans of 80s sounds and 80s music, and I think that was a sensible question. And after she asked it, I was surprised a little bit to hear Joelistics and Count Bounce let out some very heavy sighs, you know? The kind of sighs I think that Yoko Ono might once have produced when you asked her if she broke up the Beatles. They got audibly cranky and they said, it's not a retro record, it's not even an 80s record, it's just that we all grew up in the 80s. So, another 80s revival record vanishes into thin air just when I thought I had one in my clutches. Very disappointing. But the funny thing is that the more I listened to Computer Love and the more I thought about what Joelistics and Count Bounce had said, I realised that it was true, you know, that it's a fine distinction to make, but it's one very much worth making. They grew up in the 80s, these guys, you know, they grew up with Spielberg movies and Mattel toys and glowworms and Beat It and Commodore 64s and Electric Dreams and Nuclear War. That stuff stays with you, you know, you can't really escape it if you try. And all that stuff is there in that song. But if we're going to insist that Computer Love is 80s retro, that it's a pastiche or a revival of some earlier style, then I reckon we have to be able to point to something from the 80s and say, it sounds like that. And the thing is, it doesn't, you know. It seems to refer to something from the past, but if you go looking for the original, you find that it's vanished or it never existed. Let's talk about another song from last year, Far Away by Cut Copy, which I love. It's a beautiful song. It's a bouncy synth pop kind of song. It's got a great lyric revolving around a great 80s theme, the power of love to transcend distance. It all sounds very familiar, but what does it sound like exactly? Here's a thought experiment. Listen to Far Away by Cut Copy and try to imagine the band playing it in a disco in 1985. Actually, I don't have to imagine this. I saw it happen. That's right. I travelled back to 1985 with Cut Copy. It's a long story. Basically, there was this accident with a time machine built inside a DeLorean. There were some Libyans, there was some stolen plutonium. I panicked, I stepped on the gas, and the speedometer hit 88 miles per hour, and suddenly we were back in 1985. Oh my God. And then it got complicated, you know. The band and I got involved in some kind of shenanigans, some sort of high school intrigue. And as a result, the integrity of the space-time continuum was compromised. In order to prevent a temporal paradox, Cut Copy had to play a set at their future parents' high school dance. They played it safe, I'm happy to report. They played covers, oldies, oldies where we come from anyway. Beat It, The Power of Love, What a Feeling, the theme from Flashdance, St. Elmo's Fire, all of that went very well. Then, emboldened by this, I guess, they took some risks. They played Far Away from their new album, In Ghost Colours. And that started out fine, because the first verse and the chorus always remind me a little bit of Electric Dreams by Phil Oakey and Giorgio Moroder, and that was a big hit in 1985, so it made sense to the kids at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. But after that, the song breaks down into a very heavy 90s rave kind of a thing, angular, distorted synth riffs, and all the kids at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance were horrified by this. They looked like they'd never ever heard such a horrible racket, because of course they hadn't, because it was 1985 and Detroit techno was still underground and invisible, and house music was 12 months away, and Technotronic's Pump Up the Jam wouldn't be out until 1989, and Two Unlimited's Are You Ready for This wasn't even a glint in a Belgian producer's eye. So the kids had no frame of reference for what Cut Copy were doing. They might as well have been playing John Cage or Merzbow. It was awful, The dance floor came to a standstill. The kids just stood there staring at the band. The band stopped playing, and poor Dan Whitford from Cut Copy looked down at them all embarrassed and said, "Well, I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet, but your kids are going to love it." Of course, this isn't really something that happened to me in Cut Copy. It's something that happened to Michael J. Fox in the hit movie Back to the Future. And because of the peculiar babushka doll-like structure of these movies, it happens again in the sequel, Back to the Future Part 2. And I know that I'm not alone in regarding this Part 2 as the best instalment of the trilogy. It's funnier, it's scarier, it's weirder, it's more inventive, it has hoverboards in it. I was watching it again recently and enjoying the part where Marty McFly and Doc Brown travel to the future, to 2015. Doc, as always, has a plan. He tells Marty to go at a certain time and dressed a certain way to the Cafe 80s. "What's the Cafe 80s?" says Marty. "One of those nostalgia places," explains the Doc, but not done very well. When Marty gets to the Cafe 80s, we see straight away what he means. Everything in the Cafe 80s looks familiar, but none of it looks quite right. Marty is terrified. You look at his face; he looks white, and we know why. He's suffering the vertigo of having aged 30 years in a day, of finding that the stuff of his childhood is now old enough to be considered retro chic. But even worse than this is the feeling that he gets looking at the Cafe 80s, at this mismatched assortment of 80s paraphernalia, aerobics, pastels, day-glow colours, Michael Jackson, Ronald Reagan, video games. He gets the feeling that his memories have been tampered with. For those who lived through the 80s as adults, the 80s revival inspires exactly this sense of temporal panic. They look at 21-year-olds dancing to synth pop in high-waisted jeans and shoulder pads, and they feel like they're living in the Cafe 80s. Everything feels like the 80s, but not really as they remember it. And that's because the 80s revival is not really a revival at all. It's, if you were to compare it to something, I think it's more like a giant junk sculpture, a bit like the things that the presets wore at the ARIA Awards a couple of years ago. A junk sculpture made from fragments of a lost world, a lost civilization, the 80s. And it's been put together, this thing, by artists and musicians who are old enough to have had the music and films of the 80s form a part of their upbringing. But they're also young enough to treat this heritage with, I think, a very healthy combination of curiosity and disrespect. Let's take Calvin Harris, who released the unofficial theme song of the 80s revival a few years ago, Acceptable in the 80s. He admitted to Triple J that he barely remembers the 80s, that he knows Prince and David Bowie, and that's about it for 80s music as far as he's concerned. He said that there were certain sounds in 80s music that he really liked, but that the decade was also full of crap music as well. He said also that he considers it his job to refine the best bits of 80s pop, the non-crap bits, and combine them with the musical discoveries of more recent times, thereby creating an improved 1980s from the fragments of the original. The soundtrack, in other words, to the Cafe 80s. That's what Calvin Harris has been doing, the 80s condensed and done better. Of course, artists would say things like this, because no one wants to be retro. Because since Beethoven and at least since the Beatles, originality is everything in music. You've always got to prove that you're doing something new, or at least something that's original to you. So of course, when we accuse Cut Copy, TZU, Calvin Harris of being 80s revivalists, they're going to say, no, I'm not. I'm putting old stuff in a new context. I'm juxtaposing 80s pop with 90s rave. I'm being postmodern. Actually, musicians never say that, but you can see it in their eyes when they are. I'm creating new forms out of old stuff. But for some of us, this is not good enough. So what, we say? Show us a really new idea. We say this because we see the history of music as a series of revolts, where the stuffy old idols of yesterday are smashed by young punks making daring new sounds, wearing daring new pants and haircuts. Cliches, conventions and rules are cast aside, and as a result, artists are free to express real feelings in startling new ways. This happened with Elvis and rock and roll, this happened with the Beatles, it happened with punk, it happened with hip-hop, it happened with grunge in the 90s. This is the legacy of modernism, I believe, in rock and roll. It's the legacy of the realists, of the impressionists, of the futurists, of the dadaists, the surrealists, the abstract expressionists. Thanks to them, in the 20th century, and for most of the 21st, art means new art. It's a familiar story. Here's one version of it. Around 1846, the Italian-born Dante Gabriel Rossetti enrolled in a London art school called Sasser's. Sasser's was where you went if you wanted to be a painter back then, because that's where you learned the stuff that got you into the Royal Academy, which was pretty much the only game in town when it came to art education in mid-19th century England. The course at the Royal Academy took 10 years to complete. Why so long? Because before you even picked up a brush and stood in front of a model at the Royal Academy, you had to put in 5 years drawing dusty busts. That's right, dusty busts. Bits of plaster representing 500 years of the Western tradition in art. That's how you did it back then. You didn't draw from life, you copied the masters. You did this because nature was messy. It was generally understood that nature was messy. It was haphazard. It was incorrect. Nature was incorrect. But through art, human beings had corrected and perfected nature. So you studied art, not nature, if you wanted to be an artist. Anyway, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, being a young punk and a romantic to boot, quickly decided that he'd had enough of all of this. He was unimpressed with the system at the Royal Academy because he was unimpressed with the results, which to him were irredeemably sloshy. His word, sloshy. Later, he even came up with an unkind nickname for the president of the Royal Academy, the guiding light of English painting in the 19th century, Sir Joshua Reynolds, whom Rossetti liked to call Sir Sloshua. I like this word, sloshy, because I detect sloshiness occasionally in bad music, bad movies, bad stand-up comedy. Sloshiness, of course, is the result of too much second or third-hand information and not enough time spent out in the world, Too much time spent watching Seinfeld or Bill Hicks. Not enough time spent thinking about what pisses you off about modern life. Too much time spent poring over the lyrics of Rivers Como. Not enough time spent staring into the void, which is where all his good stuff comes from. So, in 1848, as a sort of a protest against sloshiness in general, Rossetti chucked in the Academy and the whole sloshy tradition of post-Renaissance painting that it sought to uphold. He wanted nothing more to do with this search for perfection, for the ideal. He wanted something real. So he looked up the address of a painter called Ford Madox Brown, who he believed could teach him everything he needed to know. He wrote Brown a really nice fan letter, and Ford Madox Brown, upon receiving it, immediately marched around to Rossetti's place with a big stick in his hand and pure cold hate in his heart. It was a misunderstanding. The thing is that Brown never ever got fan mail because he was a deeply unfashionable painter, so he assumed that Rossetti was making fun of him. It was all cleared up in the end, and Rossetti became Brown's student. And at the time, Ford Madox Brown was working on a huge canvas called Chaucer at the court of King Edward III. And we're lucky enough to be able to go visit it any time we like because it's right here, right around the corner if you want to go have a look at it later. You can see it here in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It's a big painting with a historical subject and a lot of people in it and some beautiful colours. Rossetti loved it because it was the opposite of sloshy. Sloshiness meant abstraction, cliches, lofty ideals. Brown's painting was real. It was solid, it was clear as day. Actually, the daylight was especially important. The treatment of light in 19th century painting was subject to a whole bunch of rules, one of which said that the painting should be bright in the middle and dark around the edges, preferably brown. Ford Madox Brown ignored this and painted his action as though it was lit from above by the sun. A few weeks after he met Brown, Rossetti went to the Royal Academy exhibition and he hated it, of course, except for one painting, William Holman Hunt's The Eve of St. Agnes. The subject was from the poet Keats, who wasn't at all well known back then. So for Rossetti, this was a little bit like finding someone in your office wearing a Pavement t-shirt. You know that you have to make friends with that person. Sure enough, Hunt and Rossetti made friends. They got talking and they found they had a lot in common. But more importantly, they found they were good at different things. Hunt could paint and Rossetti could talk. Soon they had a communal living space/studio, a manifesto, and even a zine, The Germ. Basically, they started one of the first modern art movements in history. But it's also a movement which has always been a little bit out of place in the history of modernism, and for a long time it was seen as something of a misstep, a mistake, or a blind alley. And to find out why, we just have to look at the initials that they painted on the bottom of all their canvases. PRB, Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This was the name that Rossetti, Hunt, and Millet gave to their secret society of revolutionary artists. You see, like all revolutionaries, Rossetti and his friends made lists. A little bit like those style thermometers that you see in the magazines sometimes, hot, not. In the not section, you'd find in their lists Sir Sloshua, of course, as well as other sacred cows of Western painting, Claude, Poussin, Dutch genre painters, hated those, and Raphael. I wonder if, given a DeLorean, a flux capacitor, some stolen plutonium, Dante Gabriel Rossetti might have ignored Doc Brown's warnings about messing with the space-time continuum, gone back in time, snatched the brush out of Raphael's hand, and pushed him into a canal. For the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, it was with Raphael that the Western tradition began to suck, the moment at which it went wrong, the moment at which painting lost the plot, hence the name Pre-Raphaelite. So with the exception of a very few modern renegades like Brown and John Ruskin and William Blake, most of the people in their hot list were from the 14th century or even earlier. They liked medieval art, they liked Shakespeare, they liked Dante and Chaucer, they liked Fra Angelico, they loved Benozzo Gozzoli. Ruskin sums up the appeal of Benozzo Gozzoli. In spite of every violation of the confounded common rules of art, of anachronisms and fancies, Abraham and Adam, Rachel and Rebecca are all there, real, visible, created, substantial in the paintings of Gozzoli. The real, that's what the Pre-Raphaelites admired. In 1858, even after 50 years of the Gothic revival, these were weird things to admire, weird things to say that you liked in public, even stranger things to emulate, but that's exactly what Rossetti did. Take a walk around while you're looking at Ford Madox Brown's painting of Chaucer and have a look at Rossetti's little painting, The Wedding of St. George. You'll see what I mean. Rossetti and the Pre-Raphaelites weren't yet living in the age of modernism where everything new had to be brand new, but they were living in an age that believed more or less in progress. And yet here was Rossetti, in the middle of the 19th century, ignoring all of the formulas to do with perspective and foreshortening and the correct use of brown that had taken artists 500 years to work out, and painting saints squeezed out perfectly flat, as one unkind critic put it. But he had his reasons for doing this. He and the other Pre-Raphaelites were going for realness, so they looked to a time when, as they saw it, painters knew less but felt more. That's why they had to throw out the canon, the list of stuff you're supposed to like, the great men, the great works. They had to get rid of it. But then having done that, they needed to replace it with something. Because as romantic as it sounds, starting from zero, no rules, no tradition, is almost impossible. At the very least, you need something that you and your friends can agree on. A set of motifs, a hero or two, a picture you like, something to strive for, maybe. And if you're very lucky, you'll find something that shows you the way forward, something that gives you the forms and the language to build an art of your own. And because we're human, because, as George Steiner puts it, the myth of the fall runs stronger in us than any particular religion, the idea that at some earlier time things were better, purer, less corrupt, because of all this, we tend to go looking for these things in the past. The old canon is destroyed and replaced with a new one made of old stuff. And this, I believe, is the secret history of rock and roll. With a couple of exceptions, rock and roll rarely revolts into completely uncharted territory. Its revolutions tend to be fueled by equal amounts of modernist disgust on the one hand, healthy modernist disgust, and a kind of furious nostalgia on the other. Take punk. Punk, of course, destroyed the canon of great works as they were generally understood in the 70s. No more Tales from Topographic Oceans, no more Dark Side of the Moon, no more Hotel California, no more Tapestry by Carole King, no more Beatles or Rolling Stones in 1976. We've all heard this story plenty of times. What's less often talked about is the furious nostalgia that underwrote punk from its very early days. Look at the songs that the Sex Pistols used to cover, Chuck Berry, Eddie Cochran, The Small Faces. Look at the terms in which American writers like Legs McNeil celebrated the music, a return to fun and innocence. Short songs, good tunes, stuff about girls and cars and sniffing glue after years of boring introspection and pompous noodling. Punks poured over Lenny Kaye's Nuggets compilation of 60s garage bands exactly the way that the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood used to study Guzzoli. It's no coincidence either that the arrival of punk coincided with the triumph of Greece. Then in 1991, all of this happened again. Talk to some music lovers today and they'll tell you that the first flowering of alternative rock, the Seattle sound, grunge, whatever you want to call it, was the last truly original idea in rock and roll. Grunge declared the rules of rock and pop as they were understood in the 80s null and void. Production values, packaging, wardrobe, hair, none of this mattered anymore. What mattered was authenticity, emotion, realness. But having knocked the glamorous heroes of the 80s off their pedestals, the new bands of the 90s very quickly replaced them with a bunch of cranky weirdos from the very distant past. The Raincoats, the Ramones, Patti Smith, Johnny Cash, William S. Burroughs, Neil Young. Again, lurking behind all this, nostalgia, a dirty secret about rock and roll revolutions, nostalgia. The kind of bittersweet longing for a mythical 70s that drives a movie like Dazed and Confused, or a film clip like the one for the Beastie Boys' Sabotage. I always like the story about how Kurt Cobain swiped the riff from Smells Like Teen Spirit from Boston's soft rock classic More Than a Feeling. When he plays that riff in the song, you can hear him doing two things at once. On the one hand, modernist disgust, destroying the past, and at the same time wishing that he could feel the way that singers felt back then, nostalgia. But this alternative rock revolution that Nirvana helped to created in time its own set of rules. And of course these rules weren't imposed from above, just like the rules of 19th century painting. They were all the stronger, all the more convincing and all the more powerful because artists followed them without even thinking about it. But rules create conventions and conventions become cliches, at which point they become useless to artists and new forms have to be found. And I believe that the story of this thing that we're calling the 80s revival is really the story of artists in search of these new forms. The rules of cutting-edge dance music in the late 90s, for example, declared that thou shalt not have songs. In order to move forward, Daft Punk had to write a song. They had to throw out this rule, they had to break the rule. And to do it, to write this song, they had to look for inspiration to the last golden age of singing over synths, of love songs for robots, which was the early 80s. The rules of being a rock singer in the late 90s said, thou shalt not dress up. Thou shalt maintain at all times a conflicted and ambivalent attitude toward thy commercial success. During the first few years of the 21st century, rock singers, new rock singers like Brandon Flowers of the Killers and Karen O from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, looked for the means to break this stalemate. And they found it in the last period during which it was acceptable to be a rock star, to dress up, wear makeup and have fun, the 80s. All of this happened about 5 years ago, but clearly there's still room for improvement because there were still taboos to be lifted, still rules to be broken, because artists are still doing it. The Galvatrons, Australian band The Galvatrons, named themselves after a character in Transformers, the movie, which came out in 1987, when the singer, Johnny Galvatron, was 4 years old. When he saw it again a few years ago, Johnny realised that this film contained an antidote to the crippling illness which threatened the life of rock and roll in 2007. He saw that everything 21st century rock lacked, ambition, imagination, synth pads, shoulder pads, could be found in the music and movies of the 1980s, because the 80s, as Johnny has said in an interview, were a more innocent time. Now, of course, this is a totally ridiculous thing to say. We know that there was nothing really innocent about the 80s. This was a decade that contained, among other things, the Challenger space shuttle disaster, Reaganomics, Black Monday, mutually assured destruction, Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer. But if you were 4 years old at the time, they could seem innocent because you were innocent. I like that story about Johnny Galvatron because I think it draws our attention to something that's often overlooked when we talk about nostalgia in rock and roll. Most rock singers are incurably romantic, and like all romantics, they're obsessed with childhood. For many rock singers, childhood is the last time the world made any kind of sense. So the sights and sounds that shape that period in their lives inevitably take on a kind of moral weight. That's why Joel Istik's and Count Bounce from TZU are so careful to emphasise the distinction between retro music, which is something that cynical record execs sell to 30-somethings, and original music informed by personal memories of the 80s, which is what they do, and which has a very different purpose, a moral purpose. Listen to the lyrics of Computer Love. They're actually very sad. The MCs take a look around at the world as it is now, and they see nothing but suffering and struggle. They never actually do anything as crass as say, it was better when we were kids. But the music, the video game bleeps, the taunting alien vocoder says it all for them. Synth pop star Ellie Jackson from LaRue also feels let down by the modern world, although like the Galvatrons, she confines her critique to the world of music. There's too much normality at the moment, she said, speaking of the present state of pop. That's why she looks beyond the ordinary stars of today to the extraordinary stars of the 1980s, to Annie Lennox, to Grace Jones, to Prince, to David Bowie. Here, the past is a stick to beat the present with, to correct its excesses and to make it admit to its failings. For LaRue, as for Cut Copy, as for the Killers, Daft Punk, the Midnight Juggernauts, Lady Hawk, TZU, all the artists we've talked about tonight, the 80s is exactly what history has been for artists through the centuries. It's a yardstick by which we can measure our own achievements and a reminder of what we may have left behind in our hurry to get to the next big thing. Artists today understand, just as Doc and Marty did back in the real 1985, that sometimes you have to go back to the past in order to save the future. Thank you.